In the summer of 1920, a Boston businessman was taking in more than $1 million a week from ordinary investors. In today's money, tens of millions of dollars, flowing in from people lining up outside his office. He promised to double their money in 90 days, and for months it actually worked. Then, in less than a single week, the entire operation collapsed, wiping out thousands of investors and leaving banks across New England on the brink of failure. His name was Charles Ponzi, and the scheme he ran was so influential that over a century later, we still call every scam built the same way a Ponzi scheme. This is the story of the original, and how the exact same structure that made it explode in popularity is what made its collapse absolutely guaranteed from day one. To understand how Charles Ponzi built one of the most famous frauds in history, you first have to understand the strange, obscure financial loophole he claimed to have discovered, and why it sounded just plausible enough to believe. Ponzi was an Italian immigrant who had arrived in the United States in 1903 and spent nearly 2 decades cycling through a series of jobs and minor legal troubles before settling in Boston. In 1919, he claimed to have identified a legitimate arbitrage opportunity involving something called international reply coupons, a form of postal voucher that could be purchased in one country and exchanged for postage stamps in another, designed to let people send prepaid return postage internationally. Because currency values differed sharply between countries in the aftermath of World War I, Ponzi claimed he could buy these coupons cheaply in certain countries and redeem them for stamps worth significantly more in the United States, pocketing the difference at enormous scale. It was a real financial mechanism, technically, just nowhere near large enough in actual practice to generate the kind of returns Ponzi was about to promise. In early 1919, Ponzi founded the Securities Exchange Company and began soliciting investments, promising a 50% return within 45 days, or a full 100% return within 90 days, an almost unbelievable rate of return, several times what any legitimate investment of the era could plausibly offer. At first, the promised returns actually got paid out. Ponzi used incoming money from new investors to pay off earlier investors exactly as promised, and word spread fast. Early investors who received their 50% return in 45 days told friends and family, who invested even more, who told still more people. Ponzi began paying commissions to agents who recruited new investors, accelerating the growth further. Within months, people were lining up outside his Boston office daily, and newspapers began covering the phenomenon of an ordinary immigrant seemingly generating extraordinary, reliable returns. By the summer of 1920, Ponzi was reportedly taking in over $1 million a week, an enormous sum for the era, from thousands of investors across New England. He purchased a mansion, hired staff, and became something of a local celebrity, held up by many as a self-made financial genius who had found a legitimate edge nobody else had noticed. None of it was sustainable, and by design, it couldn't be. Ponzi wasn't generating meaningful returns from international reply coupon arbitrage at any real scale. He was paying earlier investors with money coming in from newer ones. The entire operation depended on an ever-growing pool of new investment simply to keep the promised payouts flowing to everyone who came before. The math behind the scheme was, in retrospect, straightforward to disprove, and eventually someone did the arithmetic. In the summer of 1920, the Boston Post, working with financial analyst Clarence Barron, published an investigation calculating how many international reply coupons would actually need to be in circulation globally to support the scale of returns Ponzi was claiming to generate. The number was almost absurdly small compared to what Ponzi's claimed profits would require. There simply weren't enough coupons in existence anywhere in the world to make the numbers work. The Boston Post's reporting triggered a wave of public scrutiny and a run on Ponzi's company as nervous investors rushed to withdraw their money all at once. For a brief period, Ponzi managed to keep paying out withdrawals, temporarily calming fears and even appearing, briefly, to disprove the allegations. A stretch of good luck that only deepened public trust further, right before the underlying math caught up with him completely. Here's the irony sitting at the center of this story. The exact same viral, word-of-mouth growth structure that had made Ponzi's scheme grow so explosively, new investors funding the returns of earlier ones at an ever-accelerating pace, was, mathematically, the very thing guaranteeing its collapse. The scheme required constant, escalating new investment just to keep its existing promises, and the moment new investment growth slowed even slightly, there was no way to keep paying out what was owed. By August 1920, the surge of withdrawal requests had outpaced new investment entirely, and Ponzi could no longer cover what he owed. Auditors brought in to examine his books determined the company was massively insolvent. Investigators found Ponzi's actual assets covered only a small fraction of what he owed to investors. On August 12, 1920, Ponzi was arrested on federal mail fraud charges. The collapse extended well beyond Ponzi himself. Several Boston area banks that had extended credit tied to the scheme, or that held deposits from investors who had borrowed against their expected returns, faced serious financial strain in the aftermath, and at least a few failed outright as the scandal rippled through the local financial system. Investigators later estimated that Ponzi's victims, numbering in the tens of thousands, recovered only a fraction of what they'd invested, commonly cited at somewhere around 30 to 37 cents for every dollar they'd put in. Ponzi pleaded guilty to federal mail fraud charges and served roughly 3.5 years in federal prison. After his release, he faced additional state fraud charges in Massachusetts, was convicted again, and served further prison time. After completing his sentences, Ponzi was ultimately deported from the United States back to Italy in 1934, having never regained anything close to his former wealth or reputation. He spent his remaining years in South America, working modest jobs, including as a translator and clerk, far removed from the celebrity status he'd briefly held in Boston. Charles Ponzi died in poverty in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in 1949, largely destitute. His name, however, endures as the permanent label for exactly this kind of fraud. Even though the underlying concept of paying early investors with money from new investors existed in various forms before Ponzi, it was the scale, speed, and public spectacle of his specific scheme that fixed his name to the crime for every generation since. Charles Ponzi's story isn't really about postal coupons. It's about what happens when a scheme's own growth becomes the only thing keeping it alive, when every dollar paid out depends entirely on a larger dollar coming in behind it, forever, with no actual underlying value being created at all. It's a pattern that shows up again and again more than a century later in business history and far beyond it. Growth that depends entirely on more growth isn't really growth at all. It's just a countdown to the moment new money stops arriving fast enough and the whole structure runs out of road at once. If you'd like to understand the hidden forces shaping our global economy, help us by subscribing to our channel.